My 4-year-old climbed into our bed at 2:30 this morning, arranged himself diagonally like a starfish, and somehow took up 80% of the space. I have a king-size bed.
The diagonal is a developmental milestone they don't put in the books.
It is absolutely a milestone. I remember it vividly. And then you blink, and they're teenagers who won't get out of bed until noon, and you give anything to have the starfish back.
Okay, but I want to talk about that, the you'll miss it thing. Because right now at 5 a.m. I do not miss anything. I just want sleep.
Which is exactly where we should start. I'm Oliver Hart.
Maya Brooks.
And I'm Theo Sanders, and this is Raising Humans.
So the reason we're doing sleep this week, and specifically sleep research, is that this past week I fell down a rabbit hole. I'm in 3 parenting Facebook groups, don't judge me, and there was this enormous fight about sleep training. Someone posted about letting their 8-month-old cry it out, and you'd have thought they'd announced they were feeding the baby motor oil.
The cry it out wars. I've watched them for years, and the thing is, the actual science is so much more boring than the debate implies.
Boring in a reassuring way, hopefully.
Boring in a neither side is right way, which doesn't make great Facebook content, but there it is.
Okay, so walk me through what the research actually says, because I have heard everything. I've heard cry it out causes cortisol spikes that damage the attachment. I've heard it's totally fine. I've heard co-sleeping will kill your baby. I've heard co-sleeping is the only natural human way to sleep. I cannot locate the truth.
Right, so let's start with the cry it out data, because this one has a fairly clear story if you actually read the papers rather than the Twitter summaries. The most cited work here is probably the Wendy Hall study from around 2015, published in Pediatrics, which followed infants through 2 sleep training methods, graduated extinction, which is the formal name for cry it out, and what they called bedtime fading, which is basically shifting the bedtime later so the child is more tired. Neither method produced elevated cortisol in the infants compared to the control group. And crucially, 5 years out, the same kids showed no differences in emotional and behavioral outcomes, sleep, stress levels, or attachment security.
So the cortisol argument is
Largely not supported. There was one small study by Anna Price and colleagues around 2012 that did find cortisol elevations in infants during graduated extinction, but the cortisol in mothers dropped significantly, and by day 3 both had normalized.
So it stressed everyone out briefly, and then it worked.
That's a fair plain English summary, yes.
which is basically every hard parenting thing ever.
Pretty much.
I want to add something here because I think the cortisol conversation misses the forest for the trees a little. When my older one was a baby, this was, 16 years ago now, there wasn't this level of research available to parents. We were going on gut, on our own parents' advice, on Dr. Sears or Ferber depending on which book you grabbed at the hospital gift shop. And the guilt was still enormous either way. What's changed isn't really the guilt. It's just the vocabulary people use to weaponize it.
That's exactly it. Now, instead of you're spoiling that baby, it's you're dysregulating their nervous system.
Same instinct, laundered through neuroscience jargon.
So what does the research say a parent should actually do?
This is where I have to be honest about the limits of the evidence, because the methodologies are genuinely messy. Most sleep training studies have small samples, short follow-up windows, often just a few months, and they can't randomly assign families to conditions in any meaningful way. You can't tell half the parents in your study that they must co-sleep for a year, and the other half that they must sleep train at 4 months. People drop out, they cheat, the control groups are contaminated. So when a headline says sleep training is safe, what the data actually supports is more like, in the populations we studied, using these methods with these families, we didn't detect harm over these time frames.
Which is meaningful. That's not nothing.
No, it's not nothing, but it's not the same as a controlled trial showing positive causal outcomes, which we simply don't have.
Okay, let's talk co-sleeping, because that's the other side of the war.
So this is where the picture genuinely is more complicated, because the safety data is more serious. The AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, has maintained its advice against bed sharing since around 2011 and updated it in 2022 because the data on infant sleep-related deaths does show an association with bed sharing, particularly with infants under 4 months, particularly when parents have been drinking or smoking, or when the sleep surface is soft or cluttered.
Those are significant particularities.
They are. And this is where the public health messaging gets into trouble, because the categorical never bed share advice doesn't match how families actually live. Helen Ball, who runs the Parent-Infant Sleep Lab at Durham, has been making this argument for years. Her position, roughly, is that if you're going to tell parents not to bed share, you need to also give them a safe alternative, a way to handle the 3 a.m. feed that doesn't mean sitting upright in a chair, which is actually more dangerous than a firm bed. The hazard isn't bed sharing per se, it's the specific conditions that accompany risky bed sharing.
Which means the advice needs to be more granular than the slogan.
Exactly. Safe Sleep 7 is the La Leche League framework. Breastfeeding, non-smoking, sober, healthy baby on their back, on a safe surface, in a safe space. If you hit all 7, the risk profile looks different.
I will say, as someone who has done some amount of accidental co-sleeping, and I want to be clear, I did not plan this, my son just ended up there. The thing that scared me was falling asleep without having prepared the environment, like I hadn't thought about the pillows.
That's the real danger, right? The unplanned version.
Yes. And that's actually Ball's core argument. If you eliminate the unplanned, unsafe bed sharing that happens when parents are exhausted and just pull the baby in without thinking, you'd do more for infant safety than any blanket prohibition.
Can we talk about the 5 a.m. wake-up now? Because this is my personal villain.
Wake Up deserves its own documentary.
My daughter, she's 22 months. She's been waking between 4:45 and 5:15 every single morning for 3 months. Not upset, not hungry, just fully awake and ready to begin her day at 4:45 every day.
So this one I find genuinely interesting from a circadian biology standpoint. Young children's circadian rhythms are not miniature adult rhythms. Their melatonin release and cortisol rise patterns shift significantly across the first few years. Around 18 to 24 months, a lot of children are in a phase where their cortisol, the alerting hormone, spikes quite early in the morning. It's not a sleep problem, it's a developmental phase.
So she's not broken.
She's actually doing exactly what her biology is telling her to do. That doesn't make it easier for you, but it helps to know it's not a trainable behavior in the usual sense.
I want to offer the long view here because I have it now, and I know it's not comforting when you're in it. But both of my kids went through this phase and it did end. Not because we solved it, it just ended. Their internal clock shifted. And now I cannot get my 16-year-old to surface before 11 on weekends.
Adolescent sleep shift is real.
Very real. Mary Cascadon at Brown University has done some of the foundational work on this. There's a genuine biological delay in circadian rhythm that happens at puberty, which means teenagers aren't lazy. Their melatonin literally rises later. And then our school systems make them wake up at 6:30, which is a whole separate conversation.
A conversation I am ready to have loudly with my son's school.
But right now, in the trenches, with the 5 a.m., is there anything actually supported by evidence that might help?
A few things. Blackout blinds, and keeping the room genuinely dark until a target wake time is probably the strongest practical intervention. Light suppresses melatonin, and at those early morning hours, even a little light through a curtain gap can trigger the cortisol rise earlier. Clock lights, the toddler alarm clocks with the color change.
Oh, we have the hatch. We have had the hatch.
Right, those can work, but they're a behavioral intervention, not a biological one. You're conditioning the child to stay quiet in their room, which is useful, but the underlying biology is still doing what it does.
So best case scenario, I'm training her to stay in her room unhappily until 6.
Welcome to parenting. You have not solved the problem, you have relocated the problem.
I feel like that's a good life philosophy, actually. You don't solve problems, you relocate them.
I might put that on a mug.
Can I raise something that I think is getting undercovered in this whole conversation? We talk a lot about what sleep training does or doesn't do to the baby. We almost never talk about what the sleep deprivation does to the parent, and specifically to the parent who's absorbing the most of it, which in a majority of heterosexual households is still the mother.
Yes, thank you. Say more.
Because I watched my wife carry an enormous share of the nighttime load when our kids were small. And at the time, I am embarrassed by this. I sort of accepted it because she was breastfeeding, so it seemed logical. But the cognitive cost of that chronic sleep deprivation was real. She was less herself. And we didn't talk about it with any of the same urgency we were applying to the question of whether our son was attached enough.
There's good data on this. Functional cognitive impairment from prolonged sleep deprivation, the kind you get in the first year, is comparable to significant alcohol intoxication in some measures. Decision-making, emotional regulation, working memory, all degraded. And yes, the distribution of that load is disproportionate. A 2019 study in sleep medicine looked at parental sleep patterns and found mothers reported significantly more nighttime awakenings than fathers, regardless of whether the child was breastfed.
Regardless of whether the child was breastfed.
Regardless. It's partly habit, partly expectation, partly
the fact that sometimes the baby just wants me and will scream harder if my husband goes in.
Which is a real dynamic that makes it worse.
It is real, and it does shift. But the cumulative toll on the primary caregiver is something the sleep training conversation needs to incorporate, because parents who are not coping well are not going to be able to parent responsively, regardless of which sleep philosophy they're following.
Right? Like, you can't execute sensitive, attuned parenting if you haven't slept in 8 months.
You physically cannot. The attuned parent in the parenting books is a rested parent.
Which is another way of saying that parental well-being is a child outcome. It doesn't get labeled that way, but it should be.
Okay, so what do we actually do with all of this? Because I know Oliver's going to say the evidence is messy, which is true, but families still have to make decisions tonight.
Right. So here's what I would say the evidence genuinely supports. 1. Sleep training methods that have been studied. Graduated extinction, full extinction, bedtime fading, do not appear to cause measurable psychological harm to children when used appropriately after about 4 to 6 months. 2. Bed sharing risk is real, but it's highly conditional on circumstances and the nuanced harm reduction approach, dark, firm surface, sober, smoke-free breastfeeding, meaningfully changes the risk profile. 3. Early waking in toddlers is largely biological and mostly resolves on its own. Environment can help at the margins. 4. Parental sleep deprivation is a serious risk for.
And 5. Whatever you're doing that's working for your family is probably fine.
I will sign that as a 5th principle, yes.
I think what I take from this is, and tell me if this is too neat, there's no single method that the evidence says you must do, but there's also good reason to push back on the idea that sleep training is harmful. That particular fear is not well supported.
That's accurate. The evidence is much more reassuring than the culture war around it suggests.
And I'd add, from just having been through it, that the thing you will not remember in 10 years is which method you used. You will remember whether you felt supported, whether your partner showed up, whether you were honest with each other about how hard it was.
That actually made me a little emotional, which is annoying.
That's the sleep deprivation.
Definitely the sleep deprivation.
Before we close, I want to flag one thing that I think deserves more attention as this research area develops. There's very little longitudinal data on co-sleeping outcomes in cultures where it's the norm, not the exception. A lot of the safety warnings are built on Western household data. Specific bed types, specific parental behaviors, specific demographic correlates of risk. Researchers like James McKenna at Notre Dame have spent decades arguing that the risk calculus looks different in populations with different bed-sharing practices and different biological contexts. That doesn't mean ignore the AAP guidance, but it means the picture.
So the research isn't done.
The research is definitely not done.
Which means we're all running a live experiment in our own houses.
Great. Super reassuring. That is genuinely how I feel every night at bedtime, though. Like I'm just improvising.
You are improvising. So is everyone. The ones who seem certain are performing certainty.
I want that on a mug, more than the problem. Relocation 1.
We'll do a merch line.
Okay. Practical takeaway from me this week, I am going to be more deliberate about the environment piece. Actual blackout, not just the curtains we already have that are definitely letting light in. And I'm going to stop reading the Facebook threads about sleep training because they are making me feel worse without giving me anything useful.
That might be the highest yield intervention available.
The data would support that, I think.
From Oliver Hart, that is a 5-star endorsement. I'm Maya Brooks. This has been Raising Humans. We're back next week.
Sleep well, or, well, sleep some.
Some is enough, some is fine. This episode was generated with AI by Demades.